Psst, check this out.
Well, Aaron, welcome to the back channel. Maybe you've heard some of my other episodes around the back channel. They've previously just been me kind of thinking to myself the answer to questions that people ask me. And I'm able to do that because I know most of the answers. And I'm excited / embarrassed to say this is my first time inviting someone on because I had a founder ask me a question that I just didn't know the answer. And so I thought of you right away. Before we get to the topic and the question I actually have, can you just quickly introduce yourself and, I don't know, say a few things about why people should listen to your answer?
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me on. Glad to be your first outside guest here. My name is Aaron Ginsburg. I'm a partner at Fenwick and West. I focus in representing technology startups and the investors that fund them. Safes are the most common, early stage convertible investment instrument. It's been around for about over a decade now since YC originally introduced it, and so we see it just absolutely all the time.
So you have a little bit of experience.
Just a little bit.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let me give you the backdrop, and I'll actually say this is going to give me an opportunity to ask an even broader question. But in particular, this founder came to me and was like, "Hey, I'm having this problem. I have a lot of interest in my round. We're raising money off of safes. And I had an angel come in and they were concerned about a specific portion of the language within the safe, which they feel like put them at risk. And so she gives me the excerpt, and it essentially says that the investor has to be an accredited investor, as such term is defined in Rule 501 of Regulation D under the Securities Act. And this founder was like, well, the angel we want to bring on is not American and is not accredited in the United States. So what do we do? Can we take them on as an investor? And so I guess what I'd like to ask you first, Aaron, is before we even get into the detail of the specific language in the safe, tell me a little bit about accredited investor status.
Yeah.
What does that mean? What is it there for? And who's actually at risk here when it comes to taking on investors who are not accredited?
Great question. So it's accredited investor language ties to, as the definition of the safe says, to Regulation D of the Securities Act. And one of the laws that you need to comply with, really no matter where the investment's coming from, are the relevant securities laws. And when you're a U.S. company, the main laws that you're going to be dealing with are the U.S. securities laws. And so in order to avoid all of the complicated private placement rules, which can require a bunch of very complicated mechanics and disclosures, you need to fall within an exemption to that. And the most typical exemption that people fall within under is an accredited investor exemption, which basically says you're a investor that because you meet certain criteria, you are sophisticated enough and competent enough in the types of investing that you're doing where the securities rules say you don't need that super long list of disclosures. We can trust that you are aware enough of the risks of the types of investment that you're making.
So, and I'll give you some background. I had the language pulled up, took me 2 seconds, but I think the current definition of accredited investor right now is there's an income test, $200,000 a year alone, or $300,000 a year with a spouse for the last 2 years, or a net worth test of $1 million of net worth, excluding your primary home. And what you're telling me is that this is like a fuzzy way of the government saying, okay, this person knows what they're doing, I guess?
Yeah, that's right. So in order to meet one of these exemptions, you do have to follow the rules, right? And a little bit of a preview to where we're going to go with the answer is the clause here is not meant to opportunistically be a way for companies to retract investment or to change the terms of the investment. But it's really important that you comply with U.S. security laws or the security laws and the security laws of wherever, the investment's being made from, if the investor is foreign. And it's really a company protection, right? If there is what was that?
You said company protection.
It's a company protection. Yeah, that's right. a company protection to comply, right? The securities laws are put in place. The security laws were put in place to protect investors from lack of disclosure and to set some metes and bounds, right? So you can imagine an investor that is fresh out of college, not making much income, and is excited to invest in a startup, right? Like the securities rules, are super critical about that and saying, is this somebody that really understands what they're investing into and is a little paternalistic in that sense?
I see.
And so this accredited investor test is one easy way to determine that somebody has the type of nature and background that you can imagine that they'd be comfortable with an investment like this.
Awesome. We will put aside whether or not you or I believe that is a good set of tests to determine whether or not the person knows what they're doing, because I've had my arguments in the past when I was a formal venture capitalist, but kind of didn't fit those criteria, but I definitely knew what I was doing. Anyways, let's put that aside. One more clarifying question I have for you before we get to the meat of this particular founder's question, which is, let's say a company doesn't comply or is in violation of some of these rules. They take on Jason Ye in 2012, straight out of business school, not making $200,000 a year, not worth over $1 million. What is the liability of the company if they take on an investor who is not formally accredited?
Yeah, so that's great. So if you do that, right, let's say it's an egregious act, right? You take on someone that's purely not accredited, you know them not to be accredited, you don't have representation saying that they're accredited, right? And you say, I want their investment anyway. I mean, you violated securities laws. So you're at risk of the SEC bringing in enforcement action or writing nasty letters saying you're not complying with the laws, right? Now, if it's one $10,000 investment, right, you still violated the securities laws. Will the SEC bring in its full force and power for that, right? We can all make assumptions about where they tend to focus their resources. But there's also another risk to the company, which is if an investment is not made in compliance with securities laws, it does bring up the potential for there to be a rescission right, meaning that the investor themselves can essentially say, securities laws were complied with. I wasn't presented with these disclosures. I'm not an accredited investor, and therefore I demand that my investment is rescinded, right? Now, this is an oft-used remedy, but it's a technical one. And at scale for a startup, it can become really meaningful. And of course, people don't exercise rescission rights when you're up and to the right. It's usually when you're going through tough times or speed bumps, or they might be going through something tough. And so somebody exerting that type of right or that type of leverage can be really meaningful.
Yeah. One last detail I'll add from my perspective and my, level of expertise is around future fundraising. Should an investor need to do diligence and get into these things and actually want to go through things with a fine-tooth comb, this could be something that creates a bit of a speed bump. And I've been known to say any sort of levels of friction around fundraisers is not a good thing. I think that's something that people should be aware of. Okay.
Yeah, we always say investors have a ton of reasons to say no. You don't want to give them another one for something simple like this.
Exactly. Okay. So then let's jump into the very specific question from this founder, which is, and I don't know the full details here, but they are saying they're trying to bring on an investor who is not American, is not accredited in the US. That's actually used. So without leading the witness, how would you advise this founder to proceed if they wanted to check whether it made sense to take on an investment from this particular angel?
There are a ton of easy to make mistakes when growing a startup. I feel like I've either made them all myself or seen them all as an advisor and investor. One super common one is waiting too long to bring in expert help around managing company finances. I get why that happens though. You're not a tiny company anymore, but you feel like you're not big enough to have an in-house finance team and don't want to waste money. My advice to you is to avoid the mistake of just winging it. This is not a time to fake it till you make it. At least talk to someone early so that you can hear about how the additional help could actually save you money and improve your operations. If you're looking for recommendations on who to talk to, check out Propeller Industries. They've worked with hundreds of venture to growth stage startups, So have a ton of deep knowledge to help you avoid major bumps and set your company up for success, whether it's talking to investors or planning for future growth. Set up a free call by going to fundedpod.com/propeller. That's PROPELLER, and tell them we sent you. They're giving Funded listeners a one-time $2,500 new client credit if you work with them for 3 months.
Yeah, so it's the right question to ask here. I do have to bring a general overall disclaimer because I'm a lawyer that this is not legal advice. This is just a friendly conversation where I'm sharing some thoughts. But there is another regulation that applies to foreign investors. It's called Regulation S. And it has specific requirements where if you meet those requirements, then you don't have to meet the requirements of Regulation D. There's a point I'll make about how this works practically and how we tend to talk about this with our clients facing similar questions. But real quick on Regulation S, if the investor is a non-US person, where the sale happens offshore, right? So this can't be you're a citizen of Korea or of some other foreign country, but you essentially live in the US. That doesn't work here. No directed selling efforts in the US. You can't use this as a way to get around the US securities laws. And relatedly, there needs to be certain resale restrictions in terms of when you could sell back the shares. There's typically at least a 12-month period where there's certain additional restrictions put in place to prevent what's called flowback, which is the idea that you sell something to an outside investor to work around the US security laws for then funds that are going to flow back into the US. And as you meet those requirements, right, then you don't need to meet the accredited investor requirements, and you can instead rely on Regulation S to comply with the security laws. Now, that's the technical answer, and there's a practical one.
Okay.
That's really complicated, and it's oft used. And as a result, most startups tend to apply accredited investor tests even to foreign investors.
I see. Okay. And so even if they're foreign, then it might actually all fit within U.S. securities law.
That's right. You could also still use Regulation D to comply with a foreign investment, right? And so we're talking about U.S. securities laws. You can use Reg S, but where it gets a little tricky and where I would press in this situation is to say, is this person not accredited because they're not a U.S. investor? Or are they not accredited because they don't meet the criteria, period, right? So if we were to apply the criteria to what it is, because if you're not making, you're not passing these income or asset tests, I have this underlying question of like, is this person really aware of the speculative nature of investing in in an early stage company? And is this the type of person that like understands that this is going to be a locked up investment with, without liquidity, where there's going to be an unknown exit opportunity, right? Like we all know all startups are up and to the right, but like we have to be aware of, somebody where there's those hiccups that and every startup's journey is like this, right? That's not going to cause trouble, going to start thinking through all these issues. And so that's the issue practically that I would press on.
I think that's the great advisor in you, Aaron, saying it. The same thing that I would, which is, even when you're super dollar hungry, investment hungry, I mean, I've seen it way too often, having that investor that didn't know the risk that they were taking, didn't realize that they couldn't take that money out, is worth way less. I mean, that is way more painful than the dollars that they're investing. So that's a great call out for this particular founder. One last question, and I'll let you off the hook and get you back to your busy day. But let's say the founder does want to apply Reg S and approve this investment in that manner. And I think this answer will help us lightly answer other questions about safes, which is, when we fundraise and we use the standard safe, that allows everyone to understand it is a certain document that everyone knows the language around. When we want to apply something different to the safe, we want to make changes or whatever, how would this founder execute that? And in this case, it would be using Reg S as opposed to Rule 501 of Regulation D. How does that work?
So I wouldn't do it, the right question. So within the world, right? So I guess first recommendation is like, try to get everyone that falls within Reg D, right? Try to have everyone that's accredited. If we must enter the world of Reg S, where you don't also qualify for Reg D, there's sure things you have to keep in mind, right? I agree with you that if we don't have to touch the safe, that's the best possible way to streamline the process. And oftentimes you can achieve that through a side letter. You should be mindful that the form of safe, which I have pulled up right here, does require the investor to make a representation that they're accredited, right? And so you need to be super clear that the investor is not making that representation, or is also making the representation that they can meet the Regulation S reps. Now, really quickly, representations and warranties are just essentially saying that at the time you enter into this safe, you're making these certain promises to the company about your current status so that you can meet these exemptions. And so all of those rules I went through about what you need to do to meet Reg S would need to be representations that are built out, and you'd want the investors signed up for those, right? The other really important thing is not only would you be signing up for that, for example, in a side letter that says, I don't meet the Reg D requirements, but here are the Reg S requirements, and I can represent and warrant that as of the time I'm investing in the safe, I meet all of these. But you should be aware that not only do you need to make those reps at the time that you enter into the safe, you also have to be able to make those reps at the time that the safe converts into equity. So if the company does a Series C or Series A financing, you also need to be able to make those representations. And so that can create some complexity if you have an investor that is at the time of the safe investment abroad, but then eventually enters into the US, right? If that person's accredited, again, right, we're fine. We can go switch over to Reg D. But you have this, let's use a college student abroad. It's a brother-in-law or a friend of a friend that wants to invest. Are you going to be tracking this person, making sure they're making all the necessary Reg S and Reg D, a representation and warranties at the time of the conversion? If you're unable to do that, that's when this provision would come into play, right? If you have no other options, you're not complying with securities laws, you don't have a path under Reg D or a path under Reg S, their company needs some type of out, which is why this provision's in there to begin with. For whatever it's worth, I've never seen it actually used because most of the time we do this type of diligence up front. But I do think it's like, this is a good example of why you have to be extra critical of taking the Reg S path if that person's not also accredited.
Awesome. Wow. This I thought would be a 5-minute answer. It turns out we're post 10 minutes. We're way past 10 minutes, but I think these are the details that get people a little bit more nuanced with the handling of these instruments. I see far too many founders go through the world sort of blindly signing documents, not understanding details like this. So do your own homework, do your own diligence, find your own Aaron.
I appreciate it. Thanks for having me, Jason.
All right, Aaron, thanks.